Hola persona que me estás viendo desde Croacia, persona que me estás viendo desde la tribu croatoan, persona que me estás viendo desde el coto de Lanús, ahí sentado haciendo lo tuyo. Vamos a seguir jugando al Braid. Mi nombre es Nachito, y en esta serie vamos a estar jugando al Braid con pista de comentarios. En el capítulo anterior nos quedamos acá. Fe de ratas. En el capítulo anterior yo dije, creo, 20 aniversario. No pasaron 20 años, es solo aniversario. Como no es un número redondo, no queda bien en el título, así que Braid edición aniversario. Qué mala decisión que tomé. No me arrepiento de nada, pero acaba de salir el Blueprints y todos lo están jugando y yo no lo puedo ver porque lo quiero jugar en este canal. Sí, te estás llevando la primicia. Después de esta serie, no sé cómo lo voy a hacer correr en Mac, pero de alguna manera vamos a poder jugar al Blueprints. Empecemos a escuchar los comentarios de Blow. Todo este nivel ya lo terminamos la vez pasada, solo que sin comentarios. Vamos a hacer una repasada rápida para vos que recién te estás uniendo. Mi nombre es Nachito y en este canal vamos a jugar juegos indies, aventuras, juegos bizarros, juegos extraños, juegos inteligentes y sobre todo comentar temas de diseño y desarrollo, porque nos interesa también el costado de la producción, el costado de los creadores. A ver qué nos dice el señor Jonathan Blow, uno de mis héroes del diseño.
How did that idea develop, that there was going to be sort of distinct two things, text and the game?
It was baked into the idea at the start.
Okay.
For reasons, right? One, I kind of wanted to write something again. I had written things way in the past, and I was like, I could do something here.
Right.
It was going to be much more of a constrained writing exercise.
Okay.
So part of all of this stuff, so the Olipo, which we mentioned,
Yes.
is all about constrained writing according to rules
Yes.
or heuristics or algorithms, right?
Right.
And then, like, these specific books that I was taking inspiration from were like that.
Right.
And so I kind of liked the idea of there's gameplay in the different worlds, and that puts constraints on what the writing is. That's one direction of constraints, and then there's an orthogonal direction that's just from writing to writing. Like, the intros to these different worlds can have structural parallelism in some way. In the end, there was probably at least one too many constraints on it, and it, like, the writing quality suffered from it probably, but you know, it's fine. But like, I was just interested in that idea. And then also, even before I know it's rewind, there's this idea that doing something in gameplay is more difficult than in fiction, because in fiction fiction just depends on how good you are at rhetoric in some sense.
Right.
Like, once there was a world where
Right.
everybody walked around on their hands.
Right.
And that's just how it is.
Right.
And in games, you have to deal with what that means.
Right. Yeah.
Walking on their hands is not that good of an idea, but like, you open a door and it goes to another universe or whatever. Like, that's an idea where in fiction you can say whatever, but you're describing some rules all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And in games, you have to make those work consistently for it to be a certain class of game, a system-oriented game. Now, of course,
Right.
whenever I say this, there's always like, well, it could be like the old adventure games where there's just if statements, right?
Right. So you don't really implement the system. You just implement the like particular beats you cared about, and everything else is just not there.
Yeah, but even those are better when they feel systemy, and
Yes.
the way that people figure out. So, like Planetfall, for example,
Yes.
or Starcross actually is even
Yeah.
more. Starcross has some objects that are pretty systemy, and the way that you solve the puzzles is you know how they behave,
Yes.
and you use that to engineer the solution.
Yep.
And then the if statements happen to correctly implement the behavior that you wanted.
Right.
Right. And so it's like you're pretending the system is there, both as the player and the author, right? But as you go more forward in time and games are more capable, it's like, hey, there's more of an actual system.
Right.
And the system is more complex and nuanced. And I was very interested in that.
Vamos a tener que buscar ese juego porque parecía súper retro, y este approach que está comentando, el approach de sistemas, en vez de crear un montón de condiciones excepcionales como, bueno, si agarro este ítem y lo uso contra este enemigo, pasa tal cosa. En vez de eso, pensar tanto desde el diseño como después cuando vos lo jugás, vas a también tener que aprender a pensar de esta forma, pensar en sistemas. Esto es, este ítem que acabo de agarrar es de acero y este enemigo es resistente a este tipo de material. Por lo tanto, una vez que aprendí que hay enemigos que son resistentes al acero, puedo llevar ese conocimiento a otra clase de enemigos, a otra clase de materiales, y ahí estoy empezando a pensar en sistemas. A eso se refería.
So, the text in Braid is something that was revised a bunch of times.
The actual last time I played Braid before its release, it had substantially different text than the text that was actually released. So it was getting revised a bunch of times.
Like through development.
Throughout the development.
For sure.
And during the course of this interview, you actually said you think the text maybe wasn't as good as it could have been because, quote unquote, you were trying too hard to make it good, actually. You said that. I don't know what you mean by that. So maybe you could unpack some of that. How did you develop the text? Like, what were you sort of trying to do there? And what did you mean when you said maybe you tried too hard or something? I don't know. I really don't know what you meant. So
there's just a problem that happens if... Okay, so to relate this back to design, broadly speaking, right? One of the best skills as a game designer is to know what something looks like as somebody who just sees it for the first time. Where are their eyes being drawn? What do they think about all these things, right?
You did mention that multiple times.
It's a little bit similar with writing, probably, except I have not clocked nearly as many hours writing as I have designing games. And so there's this thing that can happen if you're really thinking hard about how to make writing do a lot of things functionally. And like, how do I do this with it? How do I do that to it? How do I connect it to this other part? How do I make it short enough, but also still have some idea in it? And two things happen. One is, unless you do a really good job refreshing yourself, you really early on stop seeing it as somebody does when they see it for the first time. And this becomes very hard. So you just see like little tweaky things about it and whatever, right? And that for sure happened.
Okay.
If I make a game, I know that what people see first helps set their expectations of what the whole thing is about. When it came to the text in Braid, because I was so looking at it up close, I probably failed to account for certain things. So for example, the World 2 text is the first text that people see. And because it's first, it sets expectations thematically for what the game is about and what the point of things are and stuff. Whereas that's actually, you know, I revised that one a bunch, probably too much. And to me, I was more setting it up parallel to the other worlds because that's the structure of the game, right? And not correctly accounting for the degree to which the first thing sets the tone. And to be honest, the World 2 text is my least favorite. It's the one that I think is like the lowest quality and the one that I was never as happy with. And so to date, I haven't revised any of the text for the Anniversary Edition, but if I did, it would probably be the World 2 text, both for this functional reason and for the fact that like I never was totally happy with it. And some of this unhappiness came from, you know, like when you're writing, being as brief as you can while doing the thing that you're trying to do is generally good advice, right?
Yes.
I think that in some cases, I was trying to be a little bit too brief while trying to do too many things. And what that manifests as is you read something and it just seems weird or like it doesn't totally connect. Because if I'd added another half of a sentence or whatever, it would have made more sense. But I cut that half of a sentence because I was very worried about the thing being too long. So like
actually some of the color, like it becomes more stilted if it's super compact.
Yeah, and in fact, that's what happened with my game developer articles is they became unreadable because they were forced to fit within a certain footprint. And I think to a little bit of an extent that happened here, especially with things like the World 2 text and whatnot. So if I were to give myself writing advice back at that time, It would be to not be so worried. Like, look, if people are going to read these at all, it's because they have an attention span.
And the people who don't are just going to run by them anyway.
Yeah, and so don't worry that much about optimizing the length.
Mm-hmm.
Because then especially, like, weird stuff happens, right? So, for example, if you're trying to write and you're trying to be concise and clear, one of the things that you would do that's, most people will give you this writing advice is to cut superfluous like adjectives and adverbs,
right?
Because even though they seem to you to be helping set the tone and stuff, they weigh something, and it becomes clumsy if you just have a lot of them, right? And they take it longer to get to the point that you're actually getting to, right? The problem is, as you try to make things short, like if I want to cut out an entire sentence that would have brought up some concept briefly, right? And it's like, oh, I want to shorten this so it doesn't have that. But I still want a little bit of a connection to what I'm going to talk about in something shorter than a sentence. I'm going to add back an adjective or an adverb, right?
Yeah.
Which then has, like, that's problematic for the reasons just discussed. And so I think some of that was happening as well, where if I had allowed myself a longer total length of text, it just wouldn't have suffered from me mashing it down, I think.
Bueno, no creo que haya realmente sufrido. Creo que se está castigando un poco demasiado. Y sí, hay una animación ahí como que se acomodó la corbata o algo. Eso tampoco estaba en el original. Yo siempre... Bueno, yo tengo un fetiche por la síntesis, por lo breve. No sé si tiene que ver con ser un millennial y tener el periodo de atención de un pez dorado, o que en general me parece que la gente que es capaz de sintetizar demuestra algún grado de inteligencia. Había una cita de Oscar Wilde: la brevedad es el alma del ingenio. Y hoy o ayer escuché una cita de Borges que también daba un consejo similar al que menciona Jonathan, que es pensá en el libro que quieras escribir y resumilo. Escribí un resumen de ese libro como si ese libro existiera. Y de hecho muchos de los cuentos de Borges son eso, cuentan una fábula como si existiera. Y eso te da cierta libertad y cierto aire. Y también te baja un poco la grandiosidad, como quién te crees que sos para... mi tiempo es valioso, loco. Pero bueno, es una posición muy millennial. Si yo fuera vos en este momento estaría viendo este video en velocidad 1.5, para que se entienda.
So we're looking at a cloud screen, in particular the cloud screen for World 2. Now, you actually iterated on this screen quite a bit. So, what's the screen meant to sort of convey or have people feel? And what was your approach to it?
The cloud screen, which we called the world and story screen as well, though it's kind of a mouthful, is a liminal space. For those of you who like liminal spaces, this is a perfect example. It's an in-between space between the what we take to be the real world of Tim's house and the imagined worlds or created worlds that you go into. And it's a moment of reforming, reshaping. The clouds are a good metaphor because, as we know, clouds change shape, and a lot of people like to look at clouds and see things. So there's an imaginative like projection onto clouds very often, which fits the whole theme of the game, of these kind of created worlds that are an extension of Tim. The clouds were present in the version of the game that John showed me when I joined the project. He wanted clouds. We had a kind of fun digression into some alternatives that didn't work ultimately, but it was, I appreciated that he was very open to me trying things out.
So yeah, I mean, you went through some iterations on this screen, and I don't want to go through the pieces of art right now, but it's like, I do want to discuss that basic idea of there was a time where you wanted these screens to sort of be a preview of the world you were going into.
Right now, every world has the same screen, except that the story is different. But this was an idea to differentiate them. And I think that's cool. I don't remember why we didn't do it. It might have been, I think maybe one problem was just that if we were to screenshot the level layout and shrink it down, it might just not look terrific, especially for worlds that have very thin floors. Then the question is, what do you put around it? And you have to paint something very fine grain to make it match, or generalize it all to a simpler version. It just wasn't a priority. There were some tricky things about it. Plus, probably conflicted with reading the text, so that didn't make it in. I think when we were doing the HD version, I may have proposed that again as though it hadn't happened before, but we didn't do it.
So, you want to design a video game. You're sitting down with a blank screen on your computer and just a vague idea. You want to make a platformer game with puzzles about rewinding time. In order to make anything, you need answers to some fundamental questions. It's a platformer. Who's the character? Human or some kind of animal mascot? How big is he? How fast does he move? What's the scale of the world? How big are levels horizontally and vertically? How much can you see on the screen at once? You can change your answers later, but before you can start building levels, you need an initial guess. And this initial guess is important because it determines how development is going to go. If you guess too wrong, you might never see the ideas that lead to the best version of your game because the territory you're exploring is too far from those ideas. Okay, anyway, we're making Braid. It's a puzzle platformer starring a human guy, and we want moving and jumping to feel good. What does that mean for the shape of the character? I knew based on experience playing other platformers that I wanted him to be fairly squat so that he would fit into a compact rectangle on the screen that was not too tall and thin. After some initial experimentation, I came up with the answer that the character should be around 2.5 heads tall. Adult humans tend to be between 7 and 8 heads tall, so this is much shorter. This convention of measuring characters in number of heads is something that illustrators have been using for a long time, and I'd become aware of it in some way or another. So I wanted a squat character, more like Mario from Super Mario Bros., and less like the humanish proportions of a classic game from my childhood, like Impossible Mission. Why did I want such a squat character? The reason is, you're trying to aim this shape through space to avoid obstacles and land on platforms and on top of moving monsters. When do you land and when do you miss? As a player, how do you aim your jump? If the character shape is too tall and thin, like adult natural human proportions, the segment between the feet is going to be narrow compared to the height of the character. And it's hard to aim this narrow segment precisely to target other objects in the game. The wider this segment is, the easier and more natural it is to hit things with it. If the character is very tall, he's going to bump his head a lot more on ceilings, which is bad. And if the baseline is pretty wide while he's tall, then he's going to take up an appreciable portion of the screen. His jump height will include so much of the screen that it limits what you can see at once, which makes puzzles harder. Also, if you're much taller than wide, it means a lot of the action of the game will involve hitting ledges from the side. But we don't want that because it's awkward in a game like this. All the important interactions in this game are vertical in nature. Did you land on top of the platform? Did you land on top of the monster? So if we make you tall and your baseline narrow, we amplify the kinds of clumsy interactions we don't want and reduce the kinds of interactions we do want. It wasn't a mistake that the characters from Donkey Kong and Mario Bros. Were very squat, because the designers of those games thought about these things. We were happy to follow in this tradition because it works well. Now, what about the actual motion? How high do you jump, and how quickly do you move through the air? These are important topics, and I cover them elsewhere. Fortunately, when making Braid, the important parameters about game mechanics were understood early on, and early decisions didn't have to be changed too much because they were in the right neighborhood.
Bueno, sorpresas. Aparentemente tenemos como niveles especiales que imagino van a tratar de demostrar esto que acaba de decir, que es todo correcto, es todo así. Incluso fíjate que en los juegos de plataformas 3D y en primera persona, ¿no? Incluso ahí la proporción entre el alto y el ancho de un jugador incluso también es más corta. Normalmente en proporción 2:1. Pensá, por ejemplo, en Minecraft, ¿no? Ni siquiera llegás a tener 2 bloques de alto. Y también es por una cuestión de previsibilidad en el movimiento, de proporción, en fin. Otro anuncio. Cuando no esté de acuerdo con algo que dice Jonathan Blow, voy a hacer esto con el personaje. Y cuando esté de acuerdo, voy a hacer esto. Porque por alguna razón le pusieron estas animaciones para mirar para arriba y para abajo, si bien no cumplen ninguna función. Seguramente va a hablar de esto porque habla de todo, como estás aprendiendo. Vamos a ver con qué nos encontramos. Rompecabezas compactos. ¿Este será el mismo nivel que viene después?
You said that in this game.
No. Ay, qué difícil es editorializar algo tan poco lineal, con tan pocas directivas de si después cuando llegue a este nivel me voy a encontrar con los mismos audios o no. De momento sigamos acá.
Where are you chronologically, game dev wise? Like you've passed the test.
I passed the test. I got hired, and we're going forward from the color studies. Actually, the background here is the background from one of the paint over hiring tests. That like pastel-y background with the notable bright pink sort of shape up there. The color palette's derived right out of that. And I remember early on I worked on a lot of grass and rocks. I spent a lot of time just painting large areas of grass, probably excessively. I think I was a little bit hung up on like, how do I do this? How am I painting? How am I working? I can tend to get overly self-conscious sometimes, but at the same time, you've got to set a baseline, and there's some process there. But I just was drawing many, many rocks, and it was kind of this repetition of a texture or a rhythm, and trying to bring in the right amount of the material qualities of like this pastel-like brush I was using, all digital work. Here's another one with that same background, a little bit of a hue adjustment, more grass and more of these rocks. Very, I guess like something I notice here is the darkness surrounding it, and it did become a motif that the foreground would kind of fade to darkness further from the playable space, further from the like gameplay surface, partly to kind of suggest a vignette effect and just draw your eye in towards the center of the screen. But something we talked about was trying to create some sense of something lurking, something undermining a little bit the cheerful feeling at the beginning of the game. One pitfall of using background elements this way to extend the foreground into space is you actually weaken the kind of immediate comprehension of the foreground. The squint test is really useful. If you squint, what do you see? And I think playing with the shapes this way does damage your clear perception of where you can stand and where the walls are, which we want to feel really immediate. We don't want the player to have to work too hard to parse any of that stuff. Now, this is just kind of incrementing towards the actual level 2-1, with the actual assets that show up in the game. I'm doing more of that grass and more rocks, but you can recognize shapes that are eventually going to be in the game, including those steps you jump up right at the beginning, including the flowers and some of the particular rocks there in the foreground, and that wall on the far left that changes a bit in the final, but that's the first wall to the left of the door. And my workflow was to develop scenes like this as paintings and then break out individual parts. This is just another progression from the last scene, and I think this is looking very much like the game now. Here's like a complete concept for the feeling and the textures and the colors in World 2. The thing that really stands out to me is the kind of watery, liquidy background, the fragmentation of the leaves up in the tree into these blocky strokes that kind of merge then into the sky, the kind of halos of blue surrounding certain things like the tree just above the door, the sense of of atmosphere that is kind of permeating everything and fragmenting everything into a blue turquoise. And of course the sun, which looks kind of like when you're making over easy eggs and they break by accident. These are just some designs for specific elements within World 2. We've got the trellises, which are climbable surfaces. And there are a couple kind of fanciful ideas and then a more conventional one, which is close to what was used in the game. I was trying something fanciful with these trees that are built like ladders somehow, or with the branches sort of... There's a kind of weird middle ground between something organic and something like highly artificial here. And I like this, and I thought it would look cool with the leaves blowing around gently. But I guess it was sensible to go with a more conventional trellis that's like an identifiable thing. And it has very clear edges as well, unlike one of the tree concepts. So you know where you can climb and where you can't. Gameplay clarity is really important. And we have some very hot-looking succulents. Throughout the game, there are spike hazards. And this is just kind of a drawing I liked of a thing that we did not use. Here's a tree that has a bunch of weird branches and shapes. It is in the game without some of those extensions, so you'll recognize that. But all these little, I guess the idea was it could be repurposed with all these add-ons, but I didn't do that. What this shows is the old art that preceded me mingled with the new art I was doing, which is kind of weird. Because John had hired somebody to do a bunch of art. You can
Tiene algo de Amanita Design,
this kind of story
la ilustración vieja
style, these gnarled trees and mushrooms and everything, all kind of out of scale to Tim. Like look at the size of those mushrooms that Tim would step on off of that ladder. It's also funny to me that it's clearly underground. There are stalactites hanging. The bounds of this space are kind of suspended within the larger background. So in other words, the walls don't go off infinitely. You're kind of held within this strangely shaped chamber made up of this tree. But anyway, it's got an interesting character of its own. But my new stuff is sitting with it, and very discordantly, but I guess the game looked like this at one point.
Hay una cita que me gusta mucho, que es difícil de traducir, pero es algo así como: la técnica o la artesanía es saber cómo hacer algo bien, como dibujar bien un árbol, por ejemplo. El arte es saber cuándo parar. Y vos fíjate la cantidad de iteraciones que hubo para cada una de las ilustraciones, para cada uno de los conceptos, que además de cumplir criterios de comunicación visual clara, por todo lo que acaba de mencionar, digamos, vos tenés que poder distinguir claramente el espacio que vos vas a estar jugando y cuáles son las plataformas interactivas y demás, de lo que está por delante, es decir, más cerca tuyo, y del fondo. O sea que tiene que haber una comunicación visual muy clara, pero además de eso vos tenés que saber decir: este es el estilo de arte, es este. Y no hay una forma de saberlo. Me pregunto si más adelante Jonathan o algún director de arte comentará cómo tomaron esa decisión, cómo dijeron: llegamos, es este el estilo. Estamos viendo todo el proceso, ¿no? Otra cosa que me quedó en el tintero mencionar respecto a la proporción de los personajes, esto de usar personajes cortitos al estilo Mario, también tiene que ver con un tema de economía en la comunicación visual. Nuestros cerebritos de monos están evolucionados para identificar muy bien formas humanas, y en particular dos patrones: el patrón de lo que está haciendo el cuerpo y el patrón de lo que está haciendo la cara. Entonces, si vos tenés que pensar en economía, y todo es pensar en economía, digamos, trade-offs, ¿qué sacrifico yo, por ejemplo, haciendo el personaje en proporción más alta o en proporción más petiza? Si tenés que ser económico, bueno, es genial hacer un personaje más cúbico y destinar mucha proporción a la cara, porque ahí estás transmitiendo mucha emoción y mucha empatía hacia el jugador. Con el espacio restante le transmitís lo que está haciendo el cuerpo, que tiene propósitos de jugabilidad, ¿no? Economía de espacio en pantalla. Cómo comprimo la mayor cantidad de información que la persona entiende intuitivamente. en el juego que estamos desarrollando en el canal de Twitch todos los fines de semana, que vos podés jugar si estás en vivo al mismo tiempo que yo, usé exactamente el mismo criterio. Desarrollé unos bebés deformes y el grueso del personaje, el cuerpo casi no aparece para que vos veas que está caminando, pero el grueso de la comunicación es la cara, para que vos lo veas todo deforme y cómo reacciona a diferentes cosas. Con muchísima más economía, porque no tengo todo el tiempo para desarrollar esto, ¿no? Solo apenas unas horas todos los fines de semana. Continuemos. Ok. Esta es la galería de todo lo que acabamos de ver.
This is a great place to look at the living painting idea, which is an extension of stuff we were doing in the old version, which has large paint strokes kind of free floating. There's an idea of fragmentation, of the world breaking down into its component parts, showing the hand of the artist, showing the artifice, the created nature of it, the fluidity of it, the malleability of it. And so in the new version, we extended that with these live brushstrokes, which were one of the most laborious things to put in. I manually placed them. I mean, first of all, I created a whole series of brushstrokes that would match different areas in the painting. So the different types of trees and shapes that you see back there, like they're the pointy evergreen style trees, and they're the little round trees back on the hill, and there are brushstrokes in the grass, and there are those like bright contour highlights along the hill. All of those got brushstrokes, which I made to be as multi-purpose as possible, but in some cases they're like specifically for a certain area. I guess the hope is that you'll at some point put the controller down or just stop moving and just look at the screen and enjoy a kind of lava lamp effect, that it's soothing and enveloping. Maybe at a moment when you're stumped and not sure what to do and you're thinking, that would be the moment where you really appreciate these details. I feel like you can run through and maybe not catch some of them, but I did spend a lot of time on it, so hopefully that's worthwhile.
For me, I may have never noticed these if you didn't point them out. Like I might have noticed that, you know, there was some, I don't know, wiggling going on, you know, like, but, you know, you did spend a lot of time on it. And, you know, I guess, do you mind that something you worked really hard on isn't necessarily noticed and might be entirely in the subconscious, if anywhere?
A little bit, because that wasn't the intention, that it wouldn't be very noticeable. It's always a matter of figuring out how subtle to be, and that was definitely a theme on Braid both times. I want you to notice these things, but I don't want you to be distracted by them. It was a process of like tuning the speed of these effects to kind of find out how like loud they should be, so to speak. If you rewind and like, you know, you can rewind faster. Like if you hit, I don't know what it is on different controllers, but rewind and then hit the bumper, left bumper a couple times or something. Well, there's a screen distortion effect that hides some of this, but you'll see, it'll be more noticeable. You'll see the paint strokes drawing, and maybe that'll help you out. But it varies scene to scene, but it should be something you can notice if you really like, maybe you need to get a really big TV or sit really close. Put your face right up to it.
Get a better TV.
Get
so
a better
you can
TV.
see my art.
Okay, what kind of 2D? There's lots of 2D.
This is sort of the bullseye of the question, which is I wasn't quite sure how you ended up with.
Well, I already
Platformer.
knew, like, okay, we're going to screw around with time,
Okay.
right? At least. And maybe we're going to do this other quantum stuff. It's unclear. But what is the form of it? Well, we know from the Calvino influence, it's about going between different worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules change in every world.
Right.
And that's what's cool about it. Like, maybe in this world there's superposition, right?
Right.
Maybe in this world there's time goes backwards, whatever.
Right.
But it's interesting that part of the entertainment value or the knowledge you take from the game is
Right.
seeing and understanding those changes, right? How do you do that? Well, somehow you're comparing them with the baseline. If you don't have the ability to compare them, like, hey, we've got this cool superposition thing. How do you understand why the superposition is interesting and how it's cool and how it affects things? Well, you know how the things would have been without the superposition, and then you add the superposition, right? And so I was thinking, hey, the value in this game is supposed to come from the cool reality bendy stuff. If the rules of the game are really complicated, and then you apply some reality bendy stuff, you might not even know, like, how some interaction would have resulted in the vanilla one, if it's complicated. And then you're going to be uncertain and unclear. And then especially if it's a puzzle game, which I was pretty sure it was going to be.
Okay.
If it's unclear what is the local reality weirdness effect and what is the base rule set, that's a level of uncertainty that you don't want on the ground level when like trying to solve puzzles, right? That's going to mess up the puzzle solving. And so I knew all this without having designed the game at all, which just, I think, tells you that I'd been thinking about this kind of thing for years in the EGW and elsewhere, right?
Right, okay.
So what are the simple kinds of games? I just thought through them, and a Mario game came to mind very quickly, right? Whereas some games in that genre have like a lot of creatures and a lot of characters with different abilities and all this stuff.
Right.
Very clearly, the prototypical Mario game is there's one monster that just goes in a straight line and you could jump on his head.
Right.
Like that's the minimum for the that genre.
Right.
And then you could dial that up. Like you could add more monsters if you want them, if you need more complexity. And so I could figure out later what is the weird stuff, and then gauge based on that how much more can the game sustain.
Right.
And I knew all this before literally typing any code.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically the selection of Mario was largely driven by wanting the simplest possible visually understandable mechanic that people would just go, okay, the baseline one is obvious to me, so that when it starts getting modified, they're not like, what the heck happened? They can clearly see like, oh, right, it's this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now you can think about some other games that are simple, like Asteroids is simple. You know, Robotron is simple. And it just, thinking through those, it's like, well, so the Mario game has this element of like, it's a guy, right?
Yeah.
And that brings it to a human scale. Like the Mario games, Mario's a character. And that's a little bit like the humanity in the stories that I wanted to like, I wanted to bridge to that. If you have like a little arrow-sized spaceship, you're not getting that, right?
Right.
So
was that a concrete thought you had when evaluating these?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I thought through a bunch of them. And in fact, this was probably the genesis of the idea that there were going to be a bunch of retro games in Braid as well. Of other
which we'll
genres.
have to talk about, since that did not actually happen.
That did not actually happen.
We should talk about those.
Yeah. We didn't compose new songs for the new edition because I don't think it's necessary, and because it's also too big of a change. I don't want to change what the game is. But we did, it's more like we invested more into a richer soundscape. Now, the actual sound effects in the original game were literally, I bought them for 99 cents on soundrangers.com and did maybe a very small amount of audio editing. They were very utilitarian. They were relatively sparse. There weren't ambient sounds of any kind, so I was relying on the music to provide ambience, whereas you can often have both. And I just wasn't thinking that much about sound besides, I mean, I was thinking a lot about it in a certain way. You know, like I said, the jump sound is very minor, and I don't want sounds that don't indicate significant changes in gameplay state and that kind of a thing. But in terms of like actual quality within one sound effect, for example, like how good of an effect is it and stuff, I think I didn't have the bandwidth to think about that. And so the sound effects in the original game are not very good. I just have to say that bluntly. It's fine
Are
because
they
they're good
updated
enough.
now?
They are updated, and they're much better. Now, they're better than they would be. So for a while, they were purely, 99-cent sound effects. And then at two different times during development, when audio guys came on and worked on it, again, I'm talking about the original game, my instructions were just take what I was doing and make it a little better. Because the problem I had, again, with multiple people, so maybe I got unlucky, or maybe this was just the times, and this was mostly by email, right? I was like, hey, I would describe in a couple paragraphs what I want, and then regardless, everything that I got back sounded to me like a sound effect from a casual game, right? Like a gem matching game, or Farmville or something, and that was wrong for this.
Twinkly.
Yeah, lots of like reverb and just like
Overprocessed.
made for people with short attention spans, it seemed like, as well, right? And maybe that's what, since these games were big at the time, there were a lot of them, and so if you're an audio freelancer, maybe that's what most of the people who try to contract your services
That's
want.
what they want, yeah. And they assume that's what you wanted.
Yeah, and after some back and forth, when I'm saying, no, I don't really want it to sound like a casual game, I couldn't get that. And so what I said was, here's my original sound effect. Just make it a little better, and we'll go with that. And so that's what we did. And so, I mean, when I say the sound effects are not very good, I mean in a certain dimension of sonic interest internal to the sound effect. How much information is there in the sound?
Did you do any variations?
A little bit, yeah, but not as many
gameplay?
as you would if you had a dedicated audio person on the game. and stuff.
Or like nothing, like what you did in The Witness, for instance.
Like, I think there might have been 2 jump variations or something,
Yeah. I mean, nowadays, the new machines are capable of creating in real time all incredible variety of variety.
Well, and also the audio team on the new game did a similar thing. They had more license to bring more creativity to it and revamp the sound effects, and they're all high quality.
Plus, you had an audio team.
Yeah, and that matters.
Have that before.
Voy a tener que escuchar la mitad de eso después cuando edite este video porque tenía que ir al baño. Pero sí que el sound design importa más de lo que parece.
The design of the basic monster character was definitely influenced by John's original programmer art character, which was a kind of flat affect or kind of moody looking yellow lumpy thing. And then Edmund McMillan worked on all the character art before me. Although in a lot of cases I redesigned the characters' faces and features, the animation cycle here is the same. So like the shape of the feet and how they're moving is Edmund's work. And when Edmund's version was like a brown hairy guy who looked kind of gloomy also. So it was always like a lumpy or hairy little round guy who looked moody. He's basically a Goomba character. Are Goombas kind of moody to begin with? They're kind of grumpy and moody.
I mean, they have no mouth, right? Like it's just eyes.
Oh, in the Sprite, you're right.
In the Sprite, yeah, the original. I mean, sure, now they do, but they tend to have, it's not furrowed. They have like diagonal brows, whatever you would call that. So there's sort of a like grumpiness to them, I'd say.
They're grumpy, yeah. So I think that's in keeping with like the inspiration, but they've got more of a human face, maybe more of a Tim face. I don't know, like I guess the texture of the hair or whatever is just sort of a shape I came up with. It's kind of feathery, so they're kind of feathery shapes. I think it was just like a furry, feathery thing that appealed to me.
This sound effect of monsters is one of the first sounds we started out to redo, since we felt the original sounds had some built-in problems. First of all, there were only 2 variations of this sound in the original game. It was this one and this one. So, especially in the later levels where the monsters are dying constantly, these 2 sound effects become very tedious. Second problem was that they actually didn't connect very well to the visuals, in our opinion. They sounded more like human voice than strange troll head things. And also they didn't connect very well to each other in the way that the 2 sounds sounded so different that you actually try to find a meaning in which sound means what, although they play totally random. So we wanted to remake the sound entirely to be able to have both more variation but also more similarity between them, although that sounds a bit like a paradox. And then we wanted to make them connect more with the visuals, which meant more non-human, but still sound like the original Braid, which meant quite human. So, yeah. Furthermore, we had a note from John saying that they should sound like, and I quote, fun with an undertone that it's sad that you are killing something that just wanted to be there, so maybe it's a little more cute with an undertone of not being cute. End quote. So, as one can imagine, this wasn't very straightforward, and we tried a billion different approaches before ending up with the sound you hear. As it often is with sound design, it ended up being my own voice barking my throat sore, which sounded like this. Oh, oh, ah, oh, oh. Yeah, these are the actual raw recordings, but they were then manipulated further afterwards. And to make it feel more physical and make it connect better visually, we also added a lot of body punch and chest sounds like this. So the original 2 very different variations of just voice playing in the game are now 14 variations of both voice and body. Another thing to note is this sound of monsters getting killed always played together with the player bouncing sound. This was a sound that was originally very cartoonish, as you can hear, and John wanted to move away from that. But still, to keep that original feel of the game and not change it too much, we remade the same sound with a large wooden ruler, but made it sound much softer and again with many more variations to it.
A ver cómo suena. Es sutil, igual.
As I said in the commentary about this monster kill sound, we went through a lot of iterations, and in the end it was signed off and everybody was happy, and the previous commentary about this sound was even recorded. And then, towards the very deadline, John had second thoughts about the sound and thought we had lost some of the original Braid idea, and I think he was right. But instead of talking about how we made yet another iteration on this sound, I'd rather talk a bit about what it is about this specific sound effect that is so hard to nail. First, we need to think, why do we even need the monsters to have a sound? Actually, we were at some point considering more sounds for them, like small clop 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 footsteps when they walk or a small mumble when they turn to make them more alive. But these considerations died quickly because that would be an extremely annoying noise in levels where they just walk mechanically back and forth. And also, exactly because they do behave so mechanical, we can't really make them come alive in any believable way. They are not NPCs that we pretend have any intelligence or free will. They are almost like robots or primitive bugs. So they should definitely not have any idle or walk sounds at all. But still, there is and should be a sound when they are killed. That sound is needed for several reasons. First, we want the player to know that the kill was executed successfully and that they gained the jump height from it. That conferring part could easily be achieved by any sound, a beep or a bell or whatever UI sound. And we actually also have the ruler sound to take care of that part. But we also want the player to know that there was a cost. You did actually kill something that wasn't just a robot. So it is a step more than just a UI sound, that you need to feel some kind of flesh and blood and mind. In the original game, John found this sound for that purpose. And it definitely does the job of confirming the kill and also making you feel a tiny bit bad about it if you have any heart at all. So John's original sound actually works and serves these two practical purposes as well. So when doing the remaster, we could have gone with that idea by just making this sound better and make some more variations of it. But as mentioned, we didn't feel this sound glued to the visuals. It felt like a sound coming from the game and not from the monsters themselves. So we would have to find the glue that glues the sound to the monster you just killed. And that's where you start thinking of what they actually are. They are a two-dimensional head with feet living inside a painting, born out of a cannon and living a sad mechanical life. They are lethal but easily killed. And what do a creature like that sound like? And of course this question is so open and abstract and can be interpreted in so many ways. So no matter what Martin and I came up with, we either disagreed internally or John thought it just didn't sound right. I started to have that feeling that we would never find the right voice for this because every person hears this differently. And you can imagine what I felt when John wanted to tweak this sound again right before the game launched. I found some examples here from that early, painful but fun process. Seen in retrospect, we were pretty settled on the body part of the sound, as you can hear, but we tried to find the voice of the monsters. And by doing that, I think we just moved more and more away from the original idea, which didn't become obvious until much later. But actually, in this case, I see now that we had the answer right in front of us. We didn't need to invent the wheel again because this is a remaster, and John already defined the voice decades ago. It seems so obvious now that we just had to add that glue that we felt was missing, and I think these body and chest sounds we developed quite early on actually does the trick. The new sounds are as simple as a bunch of extra variations of the human which I then performed myself, and then various chest punches, and also nose sounds like this one. And this is actually added for more technical reasons, to fill a bit in the upper part of the frequency spectrum. And that's something I'd always do on these important communicating sounds, make sure that they are full frequency so they stand out of the mix of the music in any kind of listening environment. So this is where these sounds ended for now at least. Let's see if there's another iteration in a week or so.
Bueno, arte es saber cuándo parar, ¿no? Y de todo lo que dijo, bueno, primero empatía con, por ser yo mismo diseñador, empatía con cuando te cambian el brief al final de todo, cuando ya hiciste todas las pruebas y te dicen, no, ¿sabes qué? Me gustaba más antes, la concha de tu madre. Y me lo imagino a John como ese tipo de jefe, por mucho que lo quiero. De todo lo que dijo, me parece que lo más valioso es lo último, cuando habla de agregar sonidos nasales para completar el espectro de sonido, porque quedaba como un hueco en los altos. Y para este tipo de decisiones que son tan personales, yo tiendo a pensar que lo primero que haces es lo correcto y después solo tenés que perfeccionarlo en una dimensión técnica. Esto de los sonidos nasales, por ejemplo, es lo que yo llamaría una dimensión técnica. Capaz es imperceptible, pero lo haces un 10% más escuchable, más íntegro, más acoplado al resto del juego, más coherente. Pero la primera decisión suele ser la mejor, también porque se percibe como más auténtico, como más orgánico. Cuanto más iteración, bueno, acá me relaciono con lo que decía John antes sobre escribir el texto, ¿no? Cuanto más te querés poner a revisarlo, más te alejás del objetivo. Capaz lo primero que habías escrito estaba fantástico y solo tenés que hacer una pasada técnica. O tal vez es que yo disfruto ver las cosas más en crudo. Siento más la conexión con el creador de esa manera.
There's something about the sound effects when you pick up puzzle pieces that many people probably don't notice. There are different sound effects for different puzzle pieces. Games of Braid's era, like many games today, would play a condescending sound when you get to a collectible that says something like, "Hey, congratulations!
Condescendiente.
You feel really good about what you just did. You solved a puzzle. Good job." I hold great disdain for games that give you big ego-inflating fireworks shows just for finishing simple tutorial levels, so I didn't want the puzzle pieces to be anything like that. But there should be a sound that is significant because success should be acknowledged, and the collection of a puzzle piece is an important change in gameplay. For a long time, I felt that I wanted the attitude of the sound effect to be kind of neutral, acknowledging that you did something that you could consider pretty good and it's probably significant, but not blowing it out of proportion or trying to stroke your ego. Things that are simple should be treated like they're simple, and things that are complex should be treated like they're complex. During the last year of development, in keeping with the theme that arose with the flags and with the ending of the game, it occurred to me that more ambiguity could be added into these puzzle piece sounds. They can indicate that you're making progress, but maybe that progress is not so positive. So I asked Harry Mack, who was working on sounds at the time, to come up with something reminiscent of happy casual game sound effects, but that felt uneasy and foreboding. There are 6 different effects because if I don't want to be like a condescending game, I want the magnitude of the sound effect to match the magnitude of the achievement. It's very easy to get the puzzle pieces in the beginning, so they should not have big sound effects. But puzzles that took a great deal of effort to get should not have tiny sound effects. I decided to break the sounds into 6 difficulty levels. I judged the difficulty of each puzzle piece and assigned the appropriate effect. Here are the 6 puzzle piece sound effects. Of course, these difficulty categorizations are inexact. What's easy for some people is hard for others, which is something I saw very clearly watching people playtest this game. So I don't take these difficulty ratings too seriously.
No sé si no te las estás tomando demasiado en serio. Es un montón. Es un montón, John. ¿Qué hace John? Qué tarado. Uy, bueno, vamos a ver si podemos escuchar todo este nivel antes de terminar este episodio. Sí, vamos a avanzar muy lento en esta serie. Así que espero que estés disfrutando la masterclass de diseño, porque si no, no sé qué estás sacando de esta experiencia.
The challenge with downstream was that the later part of the track is very intense and potentially enervating over repeated listening, especially if you're struggling to solve a puzzle. A crucial factor in this regard is the rather piercing quality of the solo violin, so a lot of work went into softening the higher frequencies. Apart from regular EQing, the plugin Soothe was used heavily to reduce frequency spikes above 4 kHz. As a result, the piece feels less aggressive, and to soften the track even further and make it sit better in the environment, a mountain-like echo was added to the overall mix. Unfortunately, we didn't have stems for downstream, which posed some challenges for the remastered version later in the game.
Esta es la parte más intensa del final del tema. Que por cierto me encanta la música. Me parece increíble. Entiendo que no fue desarrollada para este juego, fue licenciada. Así que me llama la atención que esté hablando de la persona que lo compuso.
Did you contribute in a game design sense at all, or were you strictly limited to visuals?
I did get to contribute to design a little bit, and I was happy about that. I remain proud of it because I only recently started working with John, and it was all remote over email. So I didn't know this guy, but I was excited that we were doing this thing together, and it was a great job for me to have at the time. And John was trying to figure out how to visually justify, how to make it intuitive that there are moving cloud platforms that disappear and then reappear somewhere else, kind of looping. They're just moving platforms that have to loop. And he actually emailed me and some of his designer friends, and there were a bunch of ideas. And I had the best idea, which was to use something that already existed, which were the cannons. There were already 2 kinds of cannons that shoot fireballs, which is what you would expect, and cannons that shoot monsters. So there was already an idea that cannons can shoot non-obvious things. And so the cloud was just another extension of that, like cloud cannon. And that way you have the cloud.
Me gusta la que tiene una cara de señor.
Point of the cloud. And when the cloud hits an object, hits a wall, it will disperse, and then the cannon will fire again. So yeah, it was just like kind of an elegant solution.
As a former producer, I very much appreciate the recycling of concepts.
Yeah.
Qué loco, las diferentes partes de la nube, no la había notado, pero es verdad. Hay partes que se desprenden, hay partes que rotan y hay partes que son fijas. Y yo pensé que había visto este juego con mucha atención al detalle y le sigo encontrando cosas. ¿Qué está pasando acá? Ok, sí, estos son vínculos entre mundos. Yo pensé que iban a ser como mundos separados, especiales, pero no.
It's worth going into the situation with the clouds a bit more. Early on, I had wanted some kind of platform that you could ride on, and some other games had clouds, so I did clouds too. But they were implemented in a very simple way, where they would move from left to right through a marked out region of space, and when they got to the end, they would disappear and reappear back on the left. This provided good baseline functionality, but I felt this was a very programmery behavior for clouds. Programmers understand things wrapping through an interval, but for normal people it seemed weird. And understanding this behavior was important when puzzles got hard, and when you began slowing down the clouds and so forth. With the old behavior, if you used the ring to put two clouds closer together, they would stay closer together afterward as they kept wrapping through the interval, as opposed to now when they eventually disintegrate and are replaced by fresh clouds that are evenly spaced. Also, when the clouds wrapped back to the start of the interval, they disappeared abruptly, which looked and felt unpleasant. When David suggested making a cannon that fires clouds, and turning the clouds into temporary objects just like cannonballs, it seemed like a pretty good idea to me, but I wasn't sure if we should do it, since we already had some levels that used the older style of clouds, and I might break those levels by changing the cloud behavior. In particular, there was one level early in the game that was full of lots and lots of clouds moving at different speeds to make a big mess, because I thought the mess was funny and interesting, and I wasn't sure how that would go if there were cannons firing the clouds. Thankfully, though, I decided just to change the behavior to David's idea, break the game, and fix the levels that needed fixing. The area with a mess of many clouds, I just simplified down to something cleaner because the mess of clouds was not a very deep idea overall. This eventually became the beginning of the level called the Cloud Bridge, which now has merely one cloud cannon on the left-hand side.
Bueno, con el tiempo no vamos a llegar a escuchar todo esto en este episodio. Mirá todo lo que nos queda. Yo lo estoy disfrutando un montón, pero vamos a tratar de hacer episodios de 1 hora. Último audio y cortamos por hoy.
What is parallax? Parallax primer. Parallax is, I hope I get this technically right, but it's basically the effect as you move laterally and you're looking out sort of perpendicular to your direction of movement into the distance, and you see things closer to you moving more quickly than things far away from you. If you're in a car going down the road and you look out the window, distant mountains or buildings or clouds or the sun will appear to move hardly at all while the nearby roadside or whatever is flying by. So it's one way that we perceive depth. And of course, this is a 2D game. And so the camera moving side to side is a great opportunity to create depth with parallax. And so we've added a lot more layers here. Yeah, it definitely increased the complexity and challenge of composing the scenes. You need to keep an eye on how visibility develops when the camera moves. Things get occluded by what's in front of them as the camera moves. And you want to make sure that the composition works as it evolves. And you don't want to put stuff back there that is never visible because it's always occluded. And so that's kind of an experimentation process, as well as a conscious design process. It got pretty tricky at times to compose these scenes because Braid wasn't really built to make any of this easy. Every object you see here has both a depth value and a parallax value, and they're not linked. And these are arbitrary values that I was assigning while I was playing. So, you know, something near to you might have a value of 10 or 50, and then like the hill in the background might be 500 or something. And these are numbers that I picked, again, arbitrarily. They varied from area to area. And I kind of would develop like a routine or a kind of a tendency, but then that might evolve. But I tried to leave enough space that I could put other stuff in between as well. Then the parallax value is separate, so it's on me to keep those things straight, because the problem is you can have conflicts between the depth value and the parallax value. So something that's visually behind other stuff moving faster than it, now you have a conflict and it's kind of brain breaking and looks horrible. So you absolutely can't have that. But I had to like manually track all that stuff. And when there are not too many parallax layers, it's not too hard to like throw stuff in and then find the right gaps in between for new objects. But then when I came back to add a lot more objects and it gets denser, it's very easy to find conflicts. And then all you can do is like subdivide your values more into like decimal points or try to shift things back to create more space. So it's kind of silly.
When I'm hearing that there's, a depth value and a parallax value, right? To my mind, that's just universal math. You know what I mean? That like, just keep a spreadsheet of like, know that if something's at this distance, it's this value, right? But you're saying you just kind of like observe.
I'm an artist, Frank. I shoot from the hip.
So you just kind of observed and like manually tweaked and kept observing, and like that was your process. And I'm almost wondering if by not taking a scientific approach, if by taking more of an artist approach, you might be creating interesting effects that wouldn't happen if you did things literally.
Maybe so. I don't know if it led to interesting stuff or not. I mean, I definitely did in one instance make a spreadsheet because there were enough values and things to keep track of. So I did make a spreadsheet for the depth value and the parallax values at one point, but I don't know. I think I just, again, it was simple enough in the early stages that the tools kind of encouraged me to like throw something in and then like it would be at a default value and I would like throw it back 30 and then that would be fine for all the stuff of a certain kind, like all the trees back there. And then, this one's in front, then I'd hit like Shift W or whatever, kind of bring it forward. And it just kind of was simple enough to work that way.
Got it.
But it did get to a point that I dug myself into enough of a hole, I had to make a spreadsheet.
Sí, aparte hay algo que los programadores y los ingenieros no entienden del proceso de diseño gráfico, diseño visual, que es el ajuste óptico. Técnicamente podrías decir, bueno, ese árbol está 10 metros más para atrás, por lo tanto su valor de desplazamiento es tal, y la capa detrás de ese está 20 metros más atrás, por lo tanto sería el doble, y todo puede tener sentido lógico y matemático. Y romperse visualmente cuando lo jugás porque no se siente bien. Hay algo que no te cierra y tiene que ver con los pesos visuales y los espacios visuales y una especie de percepción subjetiva que hace el ojo que no está gobernada por las matemáticas y ahí tenés que recurrir al proceso que dice este muchacho, ajustar finamente cada parte una por una hasta que al ojo le haga sentido. ¿Qué pasa si me meto por acá? ¿Qué carajo están haciendo estos portales? ¿Qué carajo están haciendo estos portales? Capaz están habilitando más comentarios. Todo esto y más lo vamos a aprender en el próximo episodio. Espero que estés entreteniéndote y aprendiendo cosas. Si no, no sé por qué estarías acá. Si no jugaste este juego, te recomiendo que abandones esta serie y lo vayas a jugar, porque te vas a comer, si no, todos los spoilers. Pero en caso de que quieras aprender temas de diseño y desarrollo, estás en el lugar correcto. Mi nombre es Nachito y nos vamos a ver en el próximo episodio. Hasta la próxima.